The character of any adult is hardly ever discernible in the boy of 12, but in the case of Emeka, that was not quite true. For one thing, he was precocious. Ever since he had been a toddler, his father had forced the pace of his development both at school and at home. As a result, there was, even by the age of 12, a growing similarity between father and son. This could have been caused by the absence of the boy's mother to be replaced by stepmothers, but more likely it was caused by any son's desire to emulate a father he respects and admires. Certainly, these sentiments were present in Emeka with regard to his father. He thought his father was a giant, which in some way he was. So consciously or unconsciously, the boy imitated his self-reliance, his independence of mind and spirit. What the father had begun, school in England completed. In those days, it was rare to find a black boy at an English boarding school. Emeka recalls even today his sense of bewilderment and loneliness when he arrived at the school to find himself, as he put it, lost in a sea of white faces. Everything was different: the climate, the people, the food, the smells, the way of life. Many small boys of 12 would have broken down in utter misery to be so far away from home in completely alien environments. Emeka stuck it out. That first hard year reminded himself constantly of one thing: I am my father's son. What would he do? Would he surrender? He would use his willpower to overcome the obstacles, so I must do the same. And he did. There had been talk of his spending 1 year at Epson until he was 13, then going to Eton, Britain's most exclusive public school. But after a year at Epson, it was decided he should stay there right through to the age of 18. Not that they were particularly unkind to him there. A guardian was appointed who turned out to be a Baptist minister who lived locally and would take the boy out during Sundays and half terms. But boarding schools in England are structured societies requiring conformism and obedience to the rules. People with strong wills usually come into conflict with rules, and the developing Emeka was no exception. Years later, during the Nigeria-Biafra War, his former housemaster at Epson was interviewed in England and asked if he remembered Emeka Ojukwu at school. Very clearly, he said, "And what was he like?" asked the interviewer. "Something of a rebel," said the master, with evident disapproval. Emeka takes the description as more of a compliment than a criticism. He had decided quite early, in emulation of the way he suspected his father would react, that when the individual is subjected to the rules of an organization, he has a clear choice. He can remain his own man or become the organization's man, and he was absolutely determined to be and stay his own man. That determination would later lead to the selection of his personal motto, "To thine own self be true," would lead him into a lot of trouble and would underline the stark contrast between himself and his one-day opponent, Yakubu Gowon. He stayed at Epson for 6 years, becoming with each passing year more and more of an Englishman. Fortunately for him, success in a British public school is never heard by being good at sports, and he excelled. For one thing, he grew up quickly, reaching a height of 6 feet, heavy and big-shouldered with it, and all bone and muscle. For another, he was fast, a sprinter on the athletics field, and a wing player at rugby football. He played rugby for the school and easily won the spring javelin throwing and discus events on the athletics field in summer. On the academic side, he was neither behind the rest nor brilliant, but had no trouble at the age of 18 in gaining a place at Lincoln College, Oxford, where he duly went in 1952. It was shortly after arriving at one of the great universities of the world that the first clash occurred between the strong-willed father and his equally strong-willed son. The father earnestly wanted his son to read law to become a lawyer, one of the professions that the Nigerians took to as duck to water. It was a profession full of prestige. But his son was becoming increasingly fascinated by the events of his own time, his own century, and the whole colonial period. He wanted to read modern history. It was the first of a series of confrontations of willpower between the two men who now resembled each other in almost every way. They looked alike, spoke alike, and thought alike, and when they did not agree on something, sparks flew. But Emeka won. He spent 1 year reading law, then switched to his own accord to modern history. Those were momentous years between 1952 and 1955. The British Empire was coming apart. India and Pakistan had gone their own way. Soon it would be the turn of Asia and African colonies. Ghana was due to get her independence in 1956. Radical student fervor was rife, and the heart of it in Oxford was the West African Students' Union, which Emeka joined with enthusiasm. Later, he reckoned he could have got a first-class degree instead of a good second if he had spent more time studying and less time engaging in student politics. But studies in one's chambers were like flat beer compared to the heady draughts of African nationalism that swept through the WASU. It was during this time that the young Emeka began to undergo a transformation that had never been desired or envisaged by his masters at Epson or his tutor at Oxford. More than any other African student, he at least ought to have become an Englishman with a black skin. His father had the wealth, the prestige, the influence, and a newly awarded knighthood. Emeka had the public school education, the mannerisms, the speech patterns, and the bearing of an Englishman. Unlike most university students arriving at age 18 from Africa for the first time, Emeka even understood England and the English. As he learned more in those years about the empire, what it had been, what it had done, and how it had done it on the face of Africa, he became increasingly aware of his own Africanness. He became aware of his growing sense of African nationalism and of the birth of a deep desire not to plead law cases in a London courtroom or join a British company, but to go back home with the expensive and elite education and serve the country of his origin in any way as best as he could. There were others at Oxford of the same persuasion: Harold Oluwasomi, Philip Asiodu, and Alison Aida. Together, they swore an oath to dedicate themselves on their return to the service of the Nigerian people rather than to the search of personal advancements. But life there was not all serious. During those 3 years, Emeka also managed to enjoy himself in the manner of young men between schooling and the disciplines of making a career. For one thing, he had a handsome allowance from his father, which enabled him to dress in the most elegantly cut suits and drive a series of the newest and fastest British sports cars. He was observed by contemporaries to be seldom out of the company of a string of very attractive young women. Then there were the parties, the weekend trips to London, and the high life of the capital. It was probably the social life that cost him a place in the Oxford rugby team of his final year. He made his place as wing 3/4 in the Lincoln College team, and as a sprinter, he was selected to pace the late great Jamaican runner MacDonald Bailey. But to make a place in the university rugby team meant a ruthless dedication to a course of extreme physical fitness. That in turn meant a choice between physical training or late night parties and a lively social life. The social life won. And there were many light-hearted periods, as when his father came to England and bought a Rolls Royce, his first such vehicle. Emeka suggested the car really ought to be running, and that he was the best suited person to do this. In this manner, he became the only student at Oxford to be observed driving to and from his lectures at the wheel of a gleaming Rolls Royce. One of his tutors so admired the vehicle that he was forever wanting a ride in it. Emeka did a deal with the professor. Soon they were to be seen cruising around in the Rolls Royce together. Emeka having his tutorials while on the move, and visiting quite a few outlying public houses whenever the strain became too much. During these 3 years, Emeka began more and more to spend his vacations in Lagos as the new air route made traveling safer and easier. There he became exposed to the facts of his father's now vast wealth and preeminence in Nigerian commercial, social, and even political life. It was during these years that his father had begun and completed the construction of his great mansion on Hawksworth Avenue, Eastern House. Here Sir Lewis kept open house, and here came the brightest stars of Lagosian life, Nigeria and British. Sir Lewis knew them all, and they all came to know his son from Oxford. In 1955, he took his Bachelor of Arts degree, came home to Lagos, and later returned to Oxford to receive his Masters of Art degree. He was 22, good-looking, talented, extremely well-educated, and destined to be very rich. He later admitted he was known in Lagos only for the cut of his London tailored suits and for his fast sports cars. There was not the slightest reason why this young dandy should not have become Nigeria's leading playboy. He could have had a life of continuing self-indulgence on the basis of his father's wealth and the almost inevitable succession into his father's shoes as the head of all the Ojukwu companies. There would have been little effort involved. And indeed that seems to have been what his father wanted, for he pressed Emeka to join him in the business empire as heir designate. The trouble was, if Sir Lewis had wanted his son to grow up as strong-willed and independent-minded as he himself had been, the job had been done only too well. The young man had not in the slightest intention of living in the shadow of his father, however large that shadow might be and however long cast its shade. He wanted to prove to himself in his own way capable of doing things by his own talents, able to cut his own path in life. For the second time, he refused to follow his father's wishes, and for the second time, the two men, so similar to each other across the gap of ages, locked horns. It was ironic that they had to quarrel, and yet almost inevitably. The son's respect for his father was a foregone conclusion. Now the father was learning to respect his son, who was turning out to be as self-willed as the father. They did not clash because they were opposites, they clashed because they were so similar. The father had tried to dominate the son. It was part of his nature. He might have lost his respect for the young man if he had succeeded. That was also part of his nature. He did not succeed. For the second time, Emeka insisted on having his own way. He told his astonished parents he was joining the Nigerian Civil Service as administrative officer. Even then, he could have used his father's influence to jump the first few bottom grades and start halfway up the ladder. His Oxford degree justified such a leap. Instead, he insisted on beginning as what was regarded as the lowest form of civil service life, assistant district officer, with a posting in a bush village. It was an odd choice for a Master of Arts from Oxford and the son of Nigeria's biggest millionaire to make. It stunned Lagos society. It was a decision that was to change Emeka's life and the lives of quite a few other people in later years. Within hours of informing his father of his decision, Emeka had packed his bag and left the luxurious mansion on Hawksworth Avenue for a room in a small, tin-roofed bungalow at Udi.